Please be seated. As we dig into the gospel passage for this morning, I think it might be helpful for us to take a little time to remember where are we in the context of Matthew's gospel as a whole. So Jesus, in this part of the gospel, has made his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, with crowds asking about him and generally making the leaders of the Jewish community quite nervous. And to make even more friends, immediately after entering Jerusalem, Jesus goes to the temple and drives out the money changers, which we know just made him popular with everybody. And then immediately following that, we get three parables. It begins with a questioning of Jesus' authority. And where does it come from? And we need to understand that the parables that follow that questioning are told to the same people who ask the questions, namely the chief priests and the elders. So we need to take care with how we interpret these parables. In particular, it's important for us to understand that Jesus is not speaking these parables in generalities. He's not telling these parables against the whole of Israel or of all Jewish peoples. Instead, he's speaking to those who are leaders in that community. He's speaking to those that have profound influence on the spiritual lives of people in Jerusalem and in Israel. And as we read the parables, it's important for us to keep in the front of our minds to whom is Jesus speaking in this part of the gospel narrative. Otherwise, we might begin to read the parables as a glorification of our own beliefs, which they are not. In today's parable, we hear Jesus using a wedding banquet as a comparison to the kingdom of heaven. The banquet hall is ready, invitations have been sent, and slaves are sent to gather the guests. And the guests say no. So the king sends a second set of slaves to say, no, come to the wedding banquet. It's ready. And they again say no, and then decide to capture, mistreat, and kill the messengers of the king. The original wedding guests have behaved in an appalling way. And their behavior enrages the king. The original guests rebuffed the invitation twice, but it was not until they mistreated the messengers of the king that the king becomes angry to the point of destruction. It's in the behavior that we find the source for the king's rage, not simply the rejection of the invitation to the wedding banquet. Now, for a long time in Christian tradition, we've heard this passage read in such a way that the original wedding guests are the whole of Israel, the whole of the Jewish people. And we certainly need to be careful about making any claim that there's no longer room for people of different faith backgrounds in the kingdom of heaven because the wedding hall is now filled with Christians. After all, the very next section of the parable includes a scene in which invitation is made rather indiscriminately. After the original guests do not come to the wedding banquet, the king sends other messengers out into the streets to, quote, invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet. The invitation is cast even more broadly, and it's not possible to know who accepts the invitation that is given in the main streets. All we can know is that the slaves go into the streets to gather everybody they find into the banquet. The doors of the kingdom of heaven have been thrown open in a new way. And we, as Gentiles, would be wise to remember that we are not the original guests. We are able to attend the wedding banquet because the nature of invitation shifted slightly. The invitation remains open to everybody, and we are there as guests. To be guests at this banquet is to remember that being a guest also includes being clothed appropriately. We, like the other guests at the banquet, need to clothe ourselves in a wedding garment. Time to learn the ways of God's household and to allow those ways to become our wedding robe. We're called to be those who take the time to prepare ourselves for the banquet. We're able to do that in the ways that we seek to love justice, to do mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. The feast to which we are invited is, as Isaiah tells us, a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines, of rich food filled with marrow, of well-aged wines strained clear. If we wish to remain in the banquet, we have to be willing to clothe ourselves according to the custom. And of course, there's been much debate about what it means to put on the wedding robe. Augustine suggested that it was good works, and especially works of love. Aquinas understood it as putting on Christ at baptism. And the reformers, like Zwingli, Luther, and Calvin, understood it as faith expressed in works of love. Now, as Christians, I think we can cling to any and all of those understandings of putting on this wedding garment. When we accept the invitation to the banquet, when we are gathered in from the streets with everybody else, we're expected to have put on the wedding robe. And we're called to remember that the love of God and the love of our neighbors is going to be central to clothing ourselves for the feast of rich food with well-aged wines. We're called to live out that love in the ways that we worship God above all others, and the ways that we extend the love of God not only to those with whom we agree, but perhaps especially to those whom we might view as antagonists or enemies. In this moment of our common life in this country, we're grappling with a lot of different sources of anxiety and turmoil. Not only are we living in a time of a pandemic that has had devastating effects on friends, family members, and neighbors, but we also are in a presidential election year that's increasingly anxious as we draw closer to Election Day. We're in a time in which it seems easier and more comforting to retreat to our corners of like-mindedness and to sequester ourselves away from those who might be different. It's a time in which it's easier to lash out at those with whom we disagree than it is for us to extend God's love to them. It's a time in which we have off to take to gather together. I mean, honestly, who wants to wear a mask or be socially distant or wash our hands so many times a day that we need moisturizing lotion to keep them from cracking. Nobody. It's a time in which we might feel short on patience, and it's a time in which being a messenger of God's invitation might feel quite secondary. But I think it's important for us to remember that it is the love of God that is steadfast. It is the love of God and of neighbor that will ultimately see us through all of these things that are swirling in the air around us. And it is the love of God that will provide us the stable ground upon which we are able to find footing. To be a wedding guest is to take the time to clothe ourselves for the banquet. It is to understand that the call to love is not one that ceases or is reserved for a certain set of peoples. Instead, it is an invitation, one that is made in the main streets to everybody that we can find, as we, the messengers of God's love, continue to extend the invitation to God's wedding